Ray, thank you very much for spending time with us today.
Glad to be here, Mike.
If you would begin, tell us, how is it that you chose a career in the CIA?
Well, it was a natural for me. I majored in Russian undergraduate and took a graduate degree in Russian. I was commissioned when I graduated from college, so I had needed to do 2 years in Army intelligence. But when I finished doing that as a Army infantry and intelligence officer, I moved to the CIA without a weekend to spare. And I was very attracted by the notion of being in one central place where all the information available on a given country or issue would be available to me, and that I would be, well, it's a word that is dropped out of the Washington lexicon, I would be accountable for making sure that the president and his senior advisors were apprised of any major developments in my area. And my area in those days was a growth industry. It was the dispute between Russia and China and the relationship that the Russians still had with the international communist movement, to include Vietnam. So it was a very live account, and I was privileged to get more than my share of little articles before the president in what's called the President's Daily Brief, a publication that has gotten some renown recently, especially as it pertains to the 9/11, what the president was told before 9/11, what he did about that or what he neglected to do. There's a special rush in telling the truth, and most important, having career protection for telling the truth. And that, Mike, of course, is what has been diddled away over the last 25 years. It's a very, very sad spectacle, not only to see the corruption of your profession, but also to see this incredible tool needed by every president, the tool of being able to go to somebody and say, tell me, give it to me straight. Tell me what you really think, you and those 2 universities worth of specialists you have out there in the woods of Virginia. Tell me what you really think. You know, in those days it was, the Air Force is telling me, says the president, the Air Force is telling me that we need to bomb North Vietnam, and that'll bring them around, and especially if we close off the Ho Chi Minh Trail with this bombing. What do you all think? Now, I worked with people who brought Ho Chi Minh into Hanoi on their shoulders at the end of World War II. I worked with people who knew Ho Chi Minh, and I also worked with people who knew the effects of bombing, what it can achieve and what it can't achieve. And so we got together and we wrote it like it was, and we told the president, in no way are the North Vietnamese communists going to give up, even if you bomb the hell out of them. And by the way, Mr. President, the Ho Chi Minh Trail doesn't look like I-66. It's a bunch of little trails, footpaths through the woods with canopy. You can't even see it, most of it, from the air. So we told the president that. I guess one of the lessons there is, once again, no president is obliged to make sensible decisions based on intelligence. He made the wrong decision, went ahead anyway, based on what he saw to be his own political needs.
So I believe I've heard you say that you think that things started to take a serious turn of events in terms of foreign policy and democracy here in the U.S. in about the 80s. Is that correct?
Well, speaking for the intelligence community, it was 1981 when William Casey was appointed and confirmed as Director of Central Intelligence and head of the CIA. Casey was a supreme spy for World War II days, but he was not sophisticated enough to realize that the Soviet challenge was a lot more subtle than he thought. What I tell folks, it's just a little bit oversimplified, but Casey would say, turn over a rock and say, oh, I see a Soviet there, whether in Africa, Asia, wherever. And those analysts would say, oh, yeah, I sure see. Oh, I see 2 of them. Well, if you saw 2 of them, you became a branch chief. If you saw 3, you become a division chief. Now, that's overstated, but just by a little, I'm sad to say. Those who smell the prevailing winds, those who made the Soviets out to be the ones, for example, who tried to assassinate the Pope when there was absolutely no evidence of that, those are the ones that got promoted. And so you ended up with a bunch of folks who tend not to be the real experts, who tend not to be the real substantive people, but the kinds of go-along to get along people. Those people started bubbling to the top under Casey and his successor, Bobby Gates. And what we ended up with after 22 years was a situation where George Tenet comes back from the White House and says, well, the administration wants to get Congress to vote for a war against Iraq. We've been able to avoid writing an estimate on whether Iraq has weapons of mass destruction so far, but that game is up. We're going to have to do that now because the Senate tells me that they're not going to vote for war unless they find out that we think that Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction. And so I wasn't there, but the way these things work is Tenet goes to the White House and says, the jig is up. I guess we have to do an estimate. And the White House tells him, well, yeah, okay, do an estimate. Just make sure of two things. Number one, make sure that estimate comes out exactly the way the Vice President said the situation was in his major speech of August 26th. We're talking in the middle of September now, 2002. Make sure you read Dick Cheney's speech very carefully. Cheney led the charge saying that Saddam Hussein had all manner of weapons of mass destruction, to include reconstituting his nuclear weapons development program, that his nuclear capability could come much sooner than anyone expects. And by the way, don't be deceived into thinking UN inspectors can do any good. They just give you a false sense of security. Those were the main points in Dick Cheney's major speech there on the 26th of August, 2002. And George Tenet, sycophant supreme, said, yes, sir. And he said, what's the other point? The other point was, well, Karl Rove wants to force this vote before the midterm elections. Of course, we're talking mid-September 2002. And so you have to get it done in 3 weeks. Tenet salutes, goes back to CIA headquarters, and I assume they still do it the way they did it in the old days, so to speak. He would convene his chief managers around the conference table of the Director of Central Intelligence, and he would have said, now we have to do this estimate. It's got to be done in 3 weeks, and it's got to come out the way Dick Cheney says. Now, in the old days, we would have looked at the director and said, you're kidding. And if we thought that the director was serious, I'd like to think we would have all just got up and walked out of that room saying, sorry, we don't do that kind of stuff. That's not our job. Now, it may be that we didn't have the courage all to walk out, but he would have known, that director would have known that he had an insurrection on his hands at the top managerial levels. Now, here it is 22 years after Casey came on. You have a whole generation of people who bubble to the top by telling the director and the White House what they think they want to hear. And so these guys saluted. The person selected to chair this estimate was a person who had worked very closely with Donald Rumsfeld. And in 3 weeks, they came up with, guess what? Saddam Hussein has all kinds of weapons of mass destruction. He's reconstituted his nuclear weapons development program. And he's a threat not only to his immediate neighbors, he's a threat to the United States. And so please vote for war. And on the strength of that estimate came out on October 1, 2002. On October 7th, the President went before the country, major speech. The first sign we may have that Saddam Hussein has a nuclear weapon could come in the form of a mushroom cloud. October 8th, Condoleezza Rice, same words. October 9th, Victoria Clark, Defense Department spokeswoman, same words, mushroom cloud. October 10th and October 11th, your representatives, your senators and mine, most of them, voted for a war that was totally unnecessary, voted for a war based on fabricated intelligence that the President and his chief advisors knew was fabricated. And so we have two things here from my perspective. Something that's very painful personally, the corruption, really the prostitution of the intelligence analysis profession. But that pales in significance when you look at the constitutional implications here. And most of us are pretty conservative types working in CIA or, in my own case, in the Army. And we have this thing about swearing an oath to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States, not the President, not the Commander-in-Chief, the Constitution of the United States, from all enemies, foreign and domestic. And we watch what was going on here with one branch of our government, the executive, deliberately deceiving the Congress, the other branch, out of its constitutional prerogative to declare or authorize war. Well, my friends, that's a constitutional crisis. And that was when, well, there's no word to explain how we felt. Outrage doesn't come close. That's when we felt we needed to form our little group, Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, and use the analytic experience and tools that we learned for several decades at taxpayer expense to turn these tools on our own government and to expose the incredible series of deceptions, prevarications, well, let's say it, lies that were responsible for starting this war, for continuing it, and for still justifying it on very dubious reasons.
We've just been talking with Ray McGovern, 27-year veteran with the CIA and co-founder of Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity.